The world is a mess. Conflicts rage, alliances crumble, power grabs dominate the headlines. From the fiery streets of Gaza to the halls of power in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, the game of nations unfolds. It's a high-stakes game where the winners take all, and the losers, well, they become history. But beneath the chaos, there's a method to the madness, a hidden logic that dictates the moves on this global chessboard. To understand the present, we must delve into the past, unearthing the forces that shape our world. Join us as we journey into the realm of geopolitics, where geography meets ambition and history whispers its warnings. This isn't just about understanding the news, it's about deciphering the code of global power. Forget about morality, forget about fairness. In the realm of geopolitics, there's only one rule: survival. Nations, like predators, are driven by self-interest, jockeying for power and influence. Geography isn't just about maps and mountains, it's the playing field where these power struggles unfold. Who controls the strategic waterways? Who dominates the resource-rich regions? These are the questions that keep presidents up at night. Geopolitics seeks to explain these power dynamics. It's about understanding why nations act the way they do, why alliances are forged and broken, and why certain regions become the epicenter of global tension. It's a cynical game, no doubt. But to survive in this world, you need to understand the rules even if you don't like them. Is history doomed to repeat itself? Are we destined to relive the mistakes of the past, trapped in a cycle of conflict and resolution? It's a question that has haunted philosophers and statesmen for centuries. Some argue that human nature is constant, driven by the same primal urges for power and dominance. Others believe that history evolves, shaped by technological advancements, shifting ideologies, and the lessons we learn, or fail to learn, from the past. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. History may not repeat itself verbatim, but it certainly rhymes. The same patterns emerge, the same geopolitical forces clash, and the same tragic mistakes are made, albeit in new and terrifying ways. By studying the past, by understanding the echoes of history, we can gain valuable insights into the present. We can learn to anticipate the moves on the global chessboard, to navigate the complexities of international relations, and perhaps, just perhaps, to avoid repeating the worst mistakes of our predecessors. Let's rewind the clock to 1989. The Berlin Wall crumbles, the Soviet Union teeters on the brink. Across the West, there's a palpable sense of triumphalism. Democracy, it seems, has won.
Enter Francis Fukuyama, the political scientist who dared to declare the end of history. His thesis, liberal democracy, with its emphasis on individual rights and free markets, had triumphed as the final form of human government. The future, he argued, would be boring. No more grand ideological battles, just the humdrum of democratic governance.
Fast forward to today. The world is anything but boring. From the rise of China to the resurgence of nationalism, from the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East to the backsliding of democracy in parts of the world, Fukuyama's thesis seems almost quaint in its naivete. What went wrong? Did Fukuyama misread the tea leaves, or was his vision of a liberal democratic world order simply a utopian fantasy? To answer that, we need to turn to his fiercest critic, Samuel Huntington.
In 1993, I countered Fukuyama's optimism with a stark warning. The future wouldn't be marked by harmony, but by conflict. Not a clash of ideologies, but a clash of civilizations.
Huntington argued that cultural and religious identities, not political or economic systems, would become the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. He identified several major civilizations: Western, Islamic, Confucian, Hindu, each with its own distinct values and worldview.
My prediction: fault lines would emerge where these civilizations meet, leading to friction, instability, and ultimately conflict. Sound familiar? Look no further than the ongoing tensions between the West and the Islamic world, from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to the rise of radical Islam.
Huntington's thesis, though controversial, has proven eerily prescient. The world is indeed witnessing a resurgence of cultural and religious identities, often accompanied by intolerance, extremism, and violence. At the heart of this geopolitical drama lies a fundamental question: Can different civilizations coexist peacefully in a world of shrinking distances and interconnected economies? Or are we destined for a future of cultural clashes and civilizational conflict? The West, with its emphasis on individual liberty, secularism, and democracy, often views itself as a beacon of progress and enlightenment. But to much of the rest of the world, particularly in the East, these values are seen as alien, even threatening, to traditional ways of life. This clash of values is playing out on multiple fronts, from debates over human rights and freedom of expression to the role of religion in public life. The West often seeks to promote its values globally, sometimes through military intervention, which is often perceived as a form of cultural imperialism. This clash of values fuels resentment, mistrust, and ultimately, conflict. It's a recipe for instability and violence, making it increasingly difficult to find common ground and build a more peaceful world. The West often presents its values, democracy, human rights, free markets as universal aspirations, applicable to all people in all places, at all times. But is this true, or are these values simply a product of the West's own unique historical and cultural experience? Critics argue that liberalism, for all its virtues, is a flawed ideology, often blind to its own shortcomings and limitations. They point to the West's history of colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation as evidence that its commitment to freedom and equality is often selective and self-serving. Moreover, they argue that liberalism's emphasis on individualism can undermine traditional values of community, solidarity, and social harmony, leading to atomization, alienation, and social unrest. The rise of populism and nationalism in the West itself is seen by some as a backlash against the excesses of liberalism. The debate over the universality of Western values is far from settled, but it underscores the challenges of building a stable and peaceful world order in an age of cultural diversity and competing ideologies. The future of conflict culture, ideology, or something else? So, where do we go from here? Is the world destined for a future of civilizational clashes? Or can we bridge the cultural divide for a harmonious global order? The answer is complex. Culture and religion shape politics, but conflict isn't just a clash of civilizations. Economic competition and power struggles drive conflict. New challenges transcend geopolitical boundaries. Climate change, pandemics, cyber warfare need global solutions. Cooperation, not conflict, is key. The future of conflict is uncertain. Understanding culture, ideology, and geopolitics is essential. Echoes in the Holy Land. The Hamas-Israel conflict looked no further than the deserts of the Levant, where history screams. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a seemingly endless cycle of violence, offers a stark illustration of Huntington's clash. Two peoples, two religions, locked in a battle for land, identity, and survival. On one side, Israel, a nation born from the ashes of the Holocaust, determined to protect its hard-won security in a hostile region. On the other, the Palestinians, dispossessed and displaced, fighting for a homeland they believe was stolen from them. The recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, the militant group that controls Gaza, is but the latest chapter in this tragic saga. Rockets rained down on Israeli cities, met with devastating airstrikes on Gaza. Civilians, as always, bear the brunt of the suffering. Both sides claim the mantle of victimhood. Both sides believe they are fighting a just war. And so the cycle continues, fueled by ancient hatreds, political opportunism, and the cynical calculations of outside powers. A region on fire, the Middle East tinderbox. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is but one symptom of a broader malaise afflicting the Middle East. This region, the cradle of civilization, is today a tinderbox, riven by sectarian strife, political instability, and the legacy of Western intervention. From the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, artificial states were carved out, often along arbitrary lines drawn by colonial powers. The result, a patchwork of nations, often led by autocrats, more concerned with consolidating their own power than addressing the needs of their people. Add to this mix the discovery of vast oil reserves, the rise of radical Islam, and the meddling of external powers, each pursuing their own geopolitical agendas, and you have a recipe for perpetual turmoil. The Arab Spring, which briefly promised a new dawn of democracy, quickly descended into chaos and violence in many countries. The so-called Islamic State, a barbaric terrorist organization, exploited the power vacuum, seizing vast swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria. The Sunni-Shia divide, a fault line of history. Underlying much of the conflict in the Middle East is a deep-seated sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia Muslims. This schism, dating back to the 7th century, is about more than just theological differences. It's about power, identity, and the very soul of Islam. Today, the Sunni-Shia divide plays out in proxy wars, terrorist attacks, and political instability across the region. Proxies and patrons, the geopolitics of sectarianism. The Sunni-Shia divide is not merely a religious conflict, it's a geopolitical battleground. Regional powers, each seeking to advance their own interests, exploit sectarian tensions to gain influence and undermine their rivals.
Iran, the self-proclaimed leader of the Shia world, backs Shia militias and political parties in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam and a staunch Sunni power, seeks to counter Iranian influence by supporting Sunni groups and governments.
The rivalry between these two regional heavyweights has turned the Middle East into a chessboard, where proxies clash and patrons pull the strings. The result, a destabilized region, vulnerable to extremism, terrorism, and endless conflict.
The West, often blinded by its own strategic interests, has often exacerbated sectarian tensions through its interventions in the region. The invasion of Iraq, for example, is widely seen as having empowered Iran and destabilized the region, creating a power vacuum that groups like ISIS were able to exploit.
Beyond the headlines, the human cost of geopolitical games, it's easy to get lost in the geopolitical chess game, but we must never forget the human cost of these conflicts. Behind the headlines are real people whose lives have been shattered. In Syria, a decade of civil war has left millions displaced. In Yemen, conflict has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. In Gaza, Palestinians are trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. These are human beings paying the price for the cynical calculations of those in power.
Let's rewind the clock to the Cold War, a time when the world was sharply divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union.
Kissinger's strategy triangulation. He sought to exploit the rivalry between the Soviet Union and China, playing them against each other to advance American interests.
Kissinger's masterstroke was to open relations with China in 1972, driving a wedge between Beijing and Moscow.
Kissinger's realpolitik, often criticized as immoral and cynical, was highly effective in managing the Cold War and preventing it from escalating into a nuclear conflagration. Fast forward to the 21st century, the world is witnessing a seismic shift in the global balance of power. China, once a sleeping giant, has awakened, its economy booming, its military growing, its ambitions soaring. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping, China has become increasingly assertive on the world stage, flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, expanding its economic influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, and challenging U.S. dominance in key technological sectors. The U.S., for its part, is struggling to adapt to this new reality. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, costly in terms of both blood and treasure, have left the American public weary of foreign entanglements. Domestic political divisions and economic challenges have further eroded U.S. power and influence. The result, a growing power vacuum on the world stage, one that China is all too eager to fill. The question is, can the U.S. and China find a way to coexist peacefully in a multipolar world, or are we destined for a new Cold War, one with potentially even higher stakes? Adding to the West's anxieties is the burgeoning relationship between China and Russia. Once bitter rivals, these two authoritarian powers have found common cause in their shared resentment of the US-led global order. The two countries have conducted joint military exercises, strengthened economic ties, and coordinated their diplomatic efforts to counter Western influence. Together, Russia and China possess vast natural resources, military might, and technological prowess, posing a formidable challenge to the West. Some advocate for a more confrontational approach, seeking to contain both Russia and China, while others argue for a more pragmatic strategy.
The rise of China and the resurgence of Russia have exposed a deeper malaise within the West, a crisis of confidence. The liberal international order, painstakingly constructed after World War II, is under strain, its institutions creaking, its values questioned.
The financial crisis of 2008, the refugee crisis in Europe, the rise of populism and nationalism, these events have shaken the West's belief in its own model of governance.
The West's response to these challenges has been hesitant and often ineffective, further eroding its credibility and emboldening its rivals. The US, once the guarantor of global security and the champion of democracy, seems increasingly inward-looking, its foreign policy erratic and unpredictable. The question is, can the West recover its footing, or is its era of global dominance coming to an end?
The world is entering uncharted waters. The old order, dominated by the West, is fading, but a new order has yet to emerge. The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear. We are moving towards a more multipolar world, one in which power is more diffuse, alliances more fluid, and the rules of the game more contested. The risk of miscalculation and conflict will be higher, as will the need for diplomacy, cooperation, and a shared understanding of the challenges facing humanity. The West must adapt to this new reality, rethinking its assumptions, rebuilding its alliances, and rediscovering its sense of purpose. For centuries, the West has enjoyed a position of unparalleled power and influence. From the era of European colonialism to the post-Cold War unipolar moment, Western nations have shaped the global order, often to the detriment of others. But those days are over. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, the growing assertiveness of regional powers, these developments are not merely challenges to the existing order, they are symptoms of a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The world is no longer a Western playground where the US and its allies can dictate terms. The sooner the West recognizes this reality, the better equipped it will be to navigate the challenges ahead. The rise of the rest, from emerging markets to global players. While the West grapples with its own internal divisions and declining influence, a new generation of players is taking center stage. Once dismissed as emerging markets, these nations are rapidly becoming global players in their own right, with their own ambitions, grievances, and worldviews. China, of course, is the most prominent example of this trend, but it's not alone. India, with its burgeoning economy and youthful population, is poised to become a major power in the 21st century. Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, these nations and others are challenging the West's dominance in international institutions, forging new alliances, and offering alternative models of development. These rising powers are not simply seeking to emulate the West, they are forging their own paths, often drawing on their own unique histories, cultures, and values. The rise of the rest has the potential to inject much-needed dynamism and diversity into the global order. The end of the American century? Managing decline or accepting reality? The US has been the world's superpower, its military unmatched, its economy envied. But the unipolar moment is over. The US is no longer the hegemon it once was, its influence waning. Wars, financial crises, and the rise of China have exposed the limits of American power. The US must manage its decline gracefully or risk further misadventures. It needs to recalibrate its role, embracing a more humble and cooperative approach. The temptation of intervention lessons not learned from Iraq to Afghanistan. The ghosts of Iraq and Afghanistan loom large over Western foreign policy. These costly and ultimately futile wars, launched in the name of spreading democracy and combating terrorism, have left a bitter legacy, undermining the West's credibility, fueling anti-Western sentiment, and demonstrating the limits of military intervention. Yet, despite the lessons of these failures, the temptation to intervene in the affairs of other nations remains strong. Whether it's the urge to topple dictators, support pro-Western regimes, or contain the influence of rivals, the West seems perpetually drawn into conflicts that are often ill-conceived, poorly executed, and ultimately counterproductive. The West needs to develop a more nuanced and sophisticated approach to foreign policy, one that recognizes the limits of military power and prioritizes diplomacy, development, and the building of international institutions. Navigating the New World Disorder, cooperation or chaos. The 21st century presents a stark choice: cooperation or chaos. The challenges facing humanity, climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, cyber warfare, are too complex, too interconnected, for any one nation to solve alone. The era of zero-sum games is over. The only way forward is together. This will require a fundamental shift in mindset, a move away from the outdated paradigms of the past, from the zero-sum logic of great power competition. It will require a recognition that we are all in this together, that our fates are intertwined, that global problems require global solutions. From the Paris Agreement on climate change to the Iran nuclear deal, from the World Health Organization to the United Nations, there are countless examples of nations coming together to address common challenges. These institutions are far from perfect, often hampered by bureaucracy, political infighting, and the self-interest of member states. But they represent the best hope for a more peaceful and prosperous future. The Western lens. A distorted view? The West loves to talk about universal values, freedom, democracy, human rights. These are the principles, we're told, that should guide all nations. But let's be honest, these universal values often look suspiciously like Western values, shaped by the West's own unique historical and cultural experience. Take democracy, for example. The West often presents it as the be-all and end-all of political systems, the only legitimate form of government. But democracy is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a messy, often chaotic process, one that requires certain cultural and institutional preconditions to thrive. Imposing democracy on societies that lack these preconditions, as the West has often attempted to do, usually ends badly. It can lead to instability, violence, and even the rise of authoritarianism. The West needs to be more humble, more self-aware in its dealings with the rest of the world. The morality trap. The West's double standards. The West loves to cast itself as the moral arbiter of the world, the defender of freedom and justice. But let's face it, the West's track record is far from spotless. From colonialism to the Cold War, from the invasion of Iraq to the drone wars in the Middle East, the West has often been on the wrong side of history. And yet, the West continues to preach from a position of moral superiority, condemning the human rights abuses of others, while turning a blind eye to its own transgressions. This hypocrisy is not lost on the rest of the world. It breeds resentment, fuels anti-Western sentiment, and undermines the West's credibility. Take, for example, the West's relationship with Saudi Arabia. This is a regime that routinely imprisons dissidents, discriminates against women, and exports a fundamentalist ideology that fuels extremism around the world. And yet, Saudi Arabia remains a close Western ally, its oil riches and strategic importance seemingly trumping any moral qualms. The end of Western hegemony. A chance for renewal or retrenchment. The decline of Western hegemony is a reality. The world is moving on, becoming more multipolar. This is not necessarily a bad thing. The West's dominance has often come at a high cost. A more equitable world order could be a good thing for everyone. How will the West respond to this new reality? Will it retreat into nostalgia, clinging to the illusion of its own exceptionalism? Or will it seize this moment for renewal, reassessing its role in the world? History's long shadow lessons from a world on fire. So here we stand, at the precipice of a new era. The old certainties are gone, the old maps obsolete. The world is a turbulent sea of shifting alliances, rising powers, and smoldering conflicts. But amidst the chaos, there's a strange comfort in the familiar rhythms of history. The same follies, the same ambitions, the same tragic mistakes playing out on a global stage. From the sun-baked sands of Gaza to the glittering skyscrapers of Shanghai, the human drama unfolds, driven by the same primal urges for power, security, and a place in the sun. The West, for so long the conductor of the global orchestra, finds itself increasingly out of tune, its instruments rusty, its sheet music scattered. The old melodies no longer resonate, and the new ones haven't quite found their rhythm. The answers, dear viewers, lie not in the dusty tomes of history, but in the choices we make today. Will we be prisoners of the past, or will we seize the opportunity to write a new chapter?